I've shared with you before that when I was in college, I studied abroad in Costa Rica. I went down with a group of students from my school, and we stayed with host families and attended classes together at a local language school. That fall, there had been a series of armed robberies in the neighborhood where we lived, just outside of San Jose. One night, after a gathering at a friend's house, I decided to head home. My friend Derek and I lived near each other, so he offered to walk me there. As we neared a street corner a few blocks from the gathering, we heard some strange noises. And as we got closer to this corner, we realized that it was screaming and shouting, but we couldn't understand the words. When we finally got to the corner and looked down the way, we could see two men with guns pointed at two other people. You know the stress response that some people have when they encounter something scary? Most people are familiar with the fight or flight response, but did you know that you can also freeze or fawn? Well, that night, I froze. I was stunned, so stunned that I couldn't move. I just stood there staring down the street, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. Thankfully, my friend Derek had the flight response. As I stood there frozen, he grabbed my arm and he dragged me away from that street corner. After a few seconds, I kind of came out of my stupor and I began to run with him as fast as I could toward the safety of our other friend's house. As we ran through the front door, we heard shots. Thankfully, we found out later that no one was hurt. But I wonder if the disciples on that road to Emmaus experienced something similar when they witnessed the crucifixion of Jesus. I wonder if the shock and grief of it all immobilized them as they tried to wrap their heads around it. I wonder if they were frozen in fear. Did that really just happen? And if that could happen to Jesus, could it happen to them too? What were they supposed to do next? And now, just 3 days later, some women had discovered that Jesus' body was gone, and they were claiming that he was alive. But how could that be? It didn't make any sense. None of it made any sense. So I wonder if that's why they decided to leave town. Scholars point out that we don't know why Cleopas and the other disciple were on the road to Emmaus. New Testament professor Eric Barreto speculates that they might have feared for their lives in Jerusalem after the death of Jesus. Maybe the sleepy town of Emmaus seemed like a safer place to be. Theologian Frederick Buechner suggests that Emmaus served as a place to escape from a situation that had become unbearable to them. All Luke tells us is that they were sad. And as they walked along, they talked about everything that had just happened. I can imagine them on that journey, trying to make sense of it all. So when this stranger came along and asked them what they were talking about, they were incredulous. They had been consumed by the events of the last few days, and they couldn't understand how anyone couldn't know what was going on. So they assumed this stranger was a foreigner. The stranger, of course, was Jesus, but they were kept from recognizing him. So they began to tell him all that had gone on in Jerusalem, how Jesus, the prophet, had been condemned and crucified. We had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel, they said. We had hoped. I don't know about you, but I hear heartbreak and hopelessness in those words. These disciples had hoped that Jesus was the one who could finally defeat the Roman Empire. They had hoped that Jesus would save them. But instead, the Roman Empire brutally killed Jesus. In the words of one pastor, the disciples were in the midst of brokenhearted days. I would venture to guess that most of us know a little something about brokenhearted days, don't we? Most of us know what it feels like to have hopes that are never realized, to have plans that don't come to fruition, to have dreams that are dashed by the circumstances of life. We know something of the bewilderment of grief, the anxiety of not knowing what comes next. Some of us have experienced that freeze response, and some of us have tried to run away when life has gotten to be too much. Buechner says that Emmaus is whatever we do or wherever we go to make ourselves forget that the world holds nothing sacred, that even the wisest and bravest and loveliest decay and die. We know that Emmaus Road. We know something about brokenhearted days because we too had hoped. But friends, this is not a Good Friday story. This is an Easter story. And the disciples aren't left alone in their disappointment and despair. This stranger, who is actually the risen Christ, meets them in the midst of their heartbreak. He walks alongside them, and he reminds them of the stories of their faith. He reminds them of the promises of the prophets and all that was to be required of the Messiah. He teaches them one more time about who he is. In other words, he helps them remember who they are and who he is. They are disciples of Jesus, the one who came to save them. So perhaps there is a lesson for us here too, for those of us who had hoped. Perhaps this story is a reminder to us that Christ doesn't leave us alone on our brokenhearted days. But even then, especially then, he's with us. He's with us whether we're frozen from fear or it's all just too much and we're trying to run away from it all. And maybe this story is also a reminder that we might not always recognize Christ when he comes to us, even when he's right beside us. In fact, he might even show up in the faces of strangers. But he's there. He's there with every one of us who had hoped. When they all reach Emmaus, Jesus keeps on walking. But the disciples stop him and invite him to stay. And this is where I think the story gets really interesting. You know, it's pretty risky for the disciples to invite a stranger to stay with them at night. After all, they know very little about this presumed foreigner. He could be a grifter, a thief who could rob them while they're sleeping. He could be violent. They really don't know. And yet, this stranger has just reminded them of who they are. They are disciples of Jesus. They have spent so much time with Jesus, learning from him and becoming more like him, that even in their heartbreak and hopelessness, they embody the values that Jesus lived out: to feed those who are in need, to offer hospitality to strangers. Jesus would have invited this man in to stay with them and share a meal. And so his disciples don't just issue a weak invitation to this stranger just to be polite. Luke says that they urge him strongly to stay with them. And he does. And when they sit down to their meal, this guest becomes the host. He takes bread and he blesses it. He breaks the bread and he gives it to the disciples. And in this reenactment of the Last Supper, they're finally able to recognize the risen Christ. He's been with them all along. Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, they ask, while he was opening the scriptures to us? And yet, if the disciples hadn't invited him in, if they hadn't offered hospitality to this stranger, they might never have had the joy of recognizing the risen Christ in their midst. It's their willingness to embody the values of Jesus, even on broken-hearted days, that allows the disciples to finally experience the resurrection for themselves. And they are so filled with wonder and joy that they can't wait to tell their friends. So they head back to Jerusalem that very same night. You know, I think the wisdom in this story is that it doesn't minimize the pain we experience. We don't know for sure why the disciples were walking that road to Emmaus, but we do know that they were grieving, that they were trying to make sense of what had happened, and they weren't sure that they could believe the claim that Jesus was alive. This story acknowledges that we too have broken-hearted days, bewildering days, days when all we can say is that we had hoped. But this story also reminds us that Christ is with us. Christ is always with us, whether we recognize his presence or not. Friends, our broken-hearted days might not be transformed in an instant as it was for the disciples. But our story isn't just a Good Friday story. It's ultimately an Easter story. And Jesus calls us to remember who we are and who he is. We are disciples of Jesus, the one who came to save us, the one who fed the hungry and welcomed the stranger, and calls us to do the same. We are disciples of Jesus, the one who was crucified, died, and was raised again for our sake. We are disciples of Jesus, and we are called to share that good news with others. May we embody the values of Jesus, and in so doing, may we experience the wonder and the joy of Easter, even on broken-hearted days. Amen.